Thanks, Mike. Good evening and welcome to tonight's talk. My name is John Wood, Vice Chair of the Society, standing in for Chairperson Robert Zatz, who's attending the Liverpool match and who sends his apologies for not being with us this evening. Our speaker, as you know, Dr. Ben Rees, an old friend to the Society, who is a prolific writer, publisher, lecturer and church minister. Many of you will remember his talk on the Welsh community who came to Liverpool, but tonight Ben will talk about the Irish immigrants. Over to you, Ben. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Thank you also for this opportunity of coming back to you. Can you see me? Yeah, good. Yes. And so the Irish in 19th century Liverpool is my theme. And I'm grateful to Mike Shitty for being the producer of this program. And there are a few slides that will be shown during the talk. Now, there are a number of cities in the world in which Liverpudlians are always welcomed. I would suggest New York is one of them. And also another one would be Dublin. And as it happens, Dublin is only 65, is nearer to Liverpool than London is. It's nearer than Tyneside or Clydeside or even Cardiff. And some Scousers would certainly be at home in Dublin, perhaps even more than in Manchester. And since the charter given by King John back in the medieval ages, Liverpool has had a very strong connection with Ireland, like it has with Wales. Indeed, I think King John chose Liverpool to keep an eye on the Irish and the Welsh. And Liverpool, like Glasgow, is a town and a city where the Irish have come in their thousands upon thousands. They came to do a lot of work, especially on the docks, and they were always around, even before the 19th century. And they reached embarrassing proportion in numbers, as John said, between 1845 and 1850. We know that they couldn't really get on with each other, that this has been the big problem, to get on with each other. There are three things that make it difficult for Irish people in Liverpool to get on with each other, well, at least in the 19th century. The first was where they came from. And sometimes they used to argue and even fight on the boats coming over to Liverpool. Men of Sligo fighting with the folk from Wexford, and those from Limerick resenting those from Roscommon. And secondly, they had disagreement on politics. Those from Northern Ireland were staunch Protestants, and also Unionists, while those from the south were mostly Roman Catholics and very staunch nationalists. Then thirdly, they disagreed over religion within Christianity, what we call Origenism against popery. Liverpool became a cockpit between them. And as they increased in number, so the violence increased. As I told you, the Irish had been coming to Liverpool since the 12th century. And but in particular, at the end of the 18th century, like the Welsh, they came and they were very useful in building the docks and working on the docks. And in 1836, a report came out, was published on the state of the Irish poor in Great Britain. It makes dismal reading. They The Welsh were included with the Irish in that report, and emphasis was placed on their poverty. One witness claimed that the Irish, as well as the Welsh, sent out their children to the streets of Liverpool to beg, and they required their children to come back on weekdays with at least 6 pence, but on market days, 18 pence. And we are going to see now the first slide, which is one of the wonderful docks that used to be in Liverpool. This is a wonderful slide.
Yeah, George's.
George's dock, of course, was the Welsh dock. It was the dock which accepted boats from North Wales, bringing slate into Liverpool. And it was built at the beginning of the 19th century and closed down after 1900. Today, that area is full of offices, and we're very near to St. Nicholas Parish Church there. And but this is where the Welsh and the Irish were instrumental in building it and also in working with it. The English in Liverpool as a whole felt that they could trust the Welsh workers much more than the Irish. That is why the Welsh were employed as workers in the new warehouses on the docks and the river. And they also stated in this report that all the heavy work in Liverpool is done by the Irish, and all the dock cleaning and muddy work by the Welsh. At least one prejudiced employer expressed his feelings to the commissioners of this report by stating that he would like to get rid of all the Celts, the Irish, the Welsh, the Scots, people from the Isle of Man, and the Cornish people. But there was no way you could stop the Irish from coming in the Hungry 40s. In 1847 alone, no fewer than 300,000 people came from Ireland, crammed on the decks of the so-called coffin boats, paying 6 pence to cross the Irish Sea. Their only possession, the ragged clothes in which they stood, herded together, drenched by spray. More than a quarter of these half-starved Irish stayed in Liverpool, while the others made an effort to cross the seas to New York and Boston. They could not apply for parish relief because this meant always being sent back to Ireland. Many of them preferred to go to the workhouse, which was situated on Brownlow Hill, or even to the prison, where there was food for them and clothing for them, and above all, roof above their heads. Edward Rushton, Liverpool's stipendiary magistrate, reported to the Home Secretary in 1849, "I saw from day to day poor Irish population forced upon us in a state of wretchedness which cannot be described. Within 12 hours after they landed, they would be found in one of three classes: paupers, vagrants, and thieves." Many of the Irish, and this is a good, it's not in Liverpool as it happens, this was taken in America, but most of the Irish were coming over in worse condition than this photograph shows. the slide shows, but at least we're back in that period. And many of them who left Liverpool for the New World were claimed by the Atlantic Ocean. It's very sad today that there are 31 migrants who are trying to come to this country from France, have been drowned in the English Channel. And so many of these Irish people were also drowned in the sea, the Atlantic Ocean, on their way to America. For example, in 1853, there was a boat called Annie Jane. It was twice compelled by storms to return to the Mersey. It had 500 emigrants on board. When it sailed for the third time, the weather was worse than ever, but the captain ignored appeals to stay. And while still in the sight of Britain, the Annie Jane foundered on rocks, her passengers drowning in their hundreds. More than 450 bodies were washed ashore on the lonely island of Wavertree in the Hebrides, where their memorial marks their communal grave. There was one man who had a great affection for the Irish, as far as Westminster was concerned. And this is his photograph. Sir Robert Peel, 1788 to 1850. He served twice as Prime Minister of Britain. The second time between 1841 and 1846. And he did a great deal for the Irish. He gave them a lot of money in that first period. And of course, he had been elected, well, sent back to Parliament anyway, as far back as 1809 for an Irish rotten borough in Galway. They had only 24 people on the electorate, and they didn't send anyone to oppose him. So he has a great deal of love for Ireland, and he did a great deal for them. And I'm going to show you another slide now of Sir Robert Peel. And this is to show his ability, his benevolence. He was secret, he was firm, and he had hope. He spoke many languages. And he's on the cover of the Beatles, St. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club. And he's the first British Prime Minister to have his photograph taken. And that was shown tonight to you as an audience. So we've got Sir Robert Peel, and he gave a lot of money to the Irish, but his fall in 1846, he had to resign because of the Anti-Corn League Act. And it was a bitter blow to the rural peasants in Ireland. A large number of problems faced them. As I've told you, they were illiterate, they were in great poverty, and many of those in Liverpool didn't trust them. Some called them lazy, but they were not lazy at all. That was just pure prejudice. And it was very unfair, for the large number of Irishmen played an important role in the life of Lancashire and north of England, and especially in the movement called the Chartism. And we're going to see a slide of the Chartists. This is not in Manchester, but this is down in London in 1849. A huge rally of people asking for certain fundamental rights, like to vote and to be able to take part in democracy. And some of the Irish were very leading members of the Chartist movement. The Irish also had their great days, as it were called. The Catholics had St. Patrick's Day on the 17th of March. And then, of course, the Orange Order remembered the Battle of the Boyne, and they remembered that in July. We've got a slide here of, this is St. Patrick's Charter, Patrick's Day celebration. And there were a lot of people died during the famine of 1845 to 50 in Liverpool. There were nearly 6,000 deaths in 1849 from cholera and 2,500 from dysentery. And they were mostly living in a congested area of Vauxhall and also in Scotland Road. According to Dr. William Duncan, the first medical officer of health in Britain and the first in Liverpool, he was very anti-Irish, and he called the cholera the Irish fever, and also mentioned that 40,000 people in 1849 contracted dysentery. 24 Catholic priests tried their best to attend to the spiritual needs of the Irish folk in their desperation, and in doing so, giving out the last rites. 10 of them died, and they have been revered ever since as the Liverpool martyrs. But in this period, Liverpool was very fortunate in having this man, Monsignor James Nugent, or as he was in the early days, Father James Nugent. His father was from Ireland. He was selling fruit near Hunter Street, where they were living. And his wife was a staunch Lancashire Roman Catholic. She was even more of a Roman Catholic than her husband was. And she was able to enjoy seeing 3 of her sons being priests and 2 of her daughters as nuns. And when he returned to his native town, Father Nugent, after being trained in Rome and also being a curate for a while in Wigan, he was shocked at the plight of thousands of children trying to make money, living on the streets of Liverpool, selling matches, shining shoes, trying to sing and begging and sleeping rough on the streets at night. To take some of these urchins, as they were called, off the streets, you open a ragged school. These schools, there were about 30 of them. The Welsh had opened one earlier in Russell Street. They provided shelter for the young urchins during the day, but there was no provision during the night. And Father Nugent took up the campaign and worked with others like William Rathbone V and Edward Rushton, the stipendiary magistrate. And their efforts culminated in an ecumenical meeting. There was nobody like this man to bring together people that were at daggers with each other. He could bring the leading lights of the Orange Order together with the Catholic Bishop of Liverpool and ministers of the Unitarian chapels, ministers of the Welsh chapels, prominent people. And one of the partners in the cause of rescuing children was an Anglican, Canon Major Lester, vicar of St. Mary's Church, Kirkdale, from 1855 to 1903. They They were Irish Catholics who resented the bond between Nugent and Major Leicester. And we can see here the statue that was placed in St. John's Gardens to James Nugent, depicting him with his arm around the shoulders of a barefoot urchin. And there's another monument in the same place to Canon Major Leicester in the same gardens. Now, Father Nugent became a leader in the cause of the children, also in the cause of temperance. We expect the Irish to be heavy drinkers, but there's always been a strong tradition of temperance among them. And there was a man from Cork who came up regularly to Liverpool to conduct conventions on temperance called Father Matthew. And James Nugent became one of his disciples. And Nugent's name is still with us in the Nugent Care Society, which does so much good still in Liverpool. It was he who established so many societies, such as the Catholic Children's Protection Society, funded through his compassion. And also the Liverpool Vigilance Society, who did a great service in protecting girls who arrived in Liverpool from Ireland with little money and no experience of living in a big city. And one must admit that for a large part of the 19th century and even into the 20th century, the annual influx of Irish girls from the other side of the Irish Sea was a blessing to Liverpool's hospitals. They would have been trouble and critically short of staff without the training of the Irish nurses and also in domestic work. One has to remember the influence of the priests within the Liverpool Irish community. Most of them in the 19th century were natives of Ireland. Father Nugent was an exception. Many of the parishes, such as St. Vincent, had at least 3 priests. The parish priest, assisted by 2 other curates, Pat O'Mara, in his interesting book, A Liverpool Irish Slummy, testifies to their great love for Ireland. He mentions Father Tooney, a young Fenian, as a curate, and O'Mara states he hated the English more bitterly than any Irishman I've ever known, and always was a source of irritation to the more prudent and diplomatic Father Ryan. The Toomey sermons from the pulpit were always looked forward to with intense glee from the congregation and with equal intense dissatisfaction by Father Ryan. One has to remember that the Irishmen in Liverpool were involved in the Fenian movement in the 1860s. Liverpool was an important centre for the Fenians and continued to be so for at least 30 years, from 1860 to 1890. Fenian activity had its headquarters in Scotland Road, and the Fenians were able to plan a large scale raid on Chester Castle in February 1867 and made a rescue of prisoners from a prisoner's van in Manchester in September of that year. This led to the trial and execution of 3 Irishmen, Allen, Larkin, and O'Brien, the Manchester Martyrs, as they are being called. I'm going to show you now a slide of where the Irish community were to be found in Liverpool in great numbers. here in Vauxhall, and especially in Everton, and also in Scotland Road. And it's interesting to look at the streets where the Irish were to be found in some streets there around Leeds Street, Addison Street, Leigh Street, were a very staunch Catholic community. The Irish, after the first shock of the Fenian activity, became more critical and articulate. By the 1870s, the number of Irish voters was around 11,000, out of an electorate about 58,000. The Irish had been very divided among themselves, and the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church had little to say to nationalism and the nationalistic ventures. It could also be said that the Irish did not realize how powerful they were as a community. Prior to Fenianism, the church, in the person of the local priest, was frequently the only authority on which they could rely. The priests in Liverpool had more influence than they had back in Ireland. In the 1868 election, for example, the clergy organised the Irish voters in Liverpool, gathering Catholic electors together in church schools before marching them off to vote for the Liberal Party. The candidates for whom they voted in local elections in the central wards of Exchange and St. Paul's and Vauxhall and Scotland Road were always Catholic liberals. But a change happened in the 1870s. The appearance of what was called Home Rule for Ireland, and a number of Home Rule councillors were first returned to the Liverpool Council in the mid-1870s. They were a clever bunch of councillors. There was Lawrence Collins. He was joined by Charles McCardle, Dr A.M. Bly, and Andrew Cummings in the following year. And the Home Rulers concentrated on the two wards where they were strong, namely Vauxhall and Scotland Road, where there were 6 seats for councillors at stake. And by 1877, all these seats had been won by the Home Rulers at the expense of the Catholic liberals. The new representatives were Irishmen of substance. Lawrence Connolly was born in Dublin in 1834. He had immigrated to Liverpool as a young man to manage the family firm of fruit merchants. Andrew Cummins was even more impressive figure than Lawrence Connolly. He was from Carlow, educated in London University, one of the first leaders of Irish Home Rulers and nationalism in Liverpool, where he had settled in 1860, a barrister with a prosperous practice, and later went on to be an MP while still remaining leader of the Home Rulers in Liverpool. It's very interesting to note that there were 9 Irishmen living in Liverpool in the 1870s and 80s who became nationalist MPs for Irish constituencies. Their home was in Liverpool, their constituencies were in Ireland. A great example of that was James Finnegan, a notorious radical, briefly MP for Ennis, and a Liverpool journalist. And the journalists, Irish journalists, were very important figures. And we're going to see one here. He was a very important figure, John Denver. John Denver wrote a book on the Irish in Britain, and it's a very useful one for any historian. And he worked hand in hand with James Nugent. He was converted to temperance and also worked on the newspapers that were started by Nugent. So journalism was important to the Irish. Take the historian, a novelist, and also journalist, Justin McCarthy, who had been involved in setting up the newspaper called Liverpool Northern Daily Times in 1853, coming before the Liverpool Daily Post, which was founded in 1855 by another Irishman, Michael James Whitty, 1795 to 1873, born in County Wexford. He was a very important figure in Liverpool because he was the man who started the fire brigade in Liverpool, and he was given by the town council the post of head police. They weren't called then chief constables, but that's what it meant. In 1835, he brought together the three aspects of the policing of Liverpool: the night police, the day police, and the dock police. And he was made head constable. And when there was a terrible riot in Liverpool in 1836, it was Whitty who showed great courage against the Orange Order when they rioted and went berserk, and even went for himself. And with 11 other men, he quelled 2,000 Irishmen, and 43 of them were sent before the magistrates and were given 6 months prison. So we've got John Denver, who worked for the United Irishmen. He also started a magazine called Nationalist in 1883. And Andrew Cummings himself stood as a candidate for Home Rule for Ireland in a by-election in 1873, but he was not elected. But Liverpool Irish made history when they were able in 1885 to get another journalist elected as MP for Scotland constituency in the person of this man, Thomas Power O'Connor. Tay pay to his followers. He founded and edited several newspapers, including The Star, which went between 1887 and 1960, and TB Weekly, which started in 1898. Now, he was born in Athlone, Ireland, on 5th of October, 1848. He represented Galway in 1880, and then in 1885, he became the first nationalist MP for an English constituency. Can you believe it? You had in Liverpool for Scotland Road an Irish nationalist MP, and he stayed there till 1929. He was a lone voice in Westminster often. To O'Connor, Liverpool is the heart of the world. There is poetry in every step of walk along his far-reaching way. Not bad for an MP who didn't walk much of the streets of Liverpool. He visited Liverpool, Scotland Division constituency so rarely that he was called a carpet bagger. You had in Wavertree a similar man in Sir Irvine, James Irvine, the Labour MP who never came up except for the day before the election and walked down from Picton Clock to High Street and then appeared with Wilson in Philharmonic at that night, stayed in Adelphi for that night, heard the result and went back to London for another 5 years, and Wavertree never saw him. And that's why David Alton won Wavertree for the Liberals. Now, this man was very much alike James Irvine, but the people in Liverpool, Scotland loved him. And when the Irish Free State was established in 1922, everybody thought, well, he'll resign. But he didn't. He stood again in 1923 and in 1924, and handing over to his Labour successor in the 1929 election. So confident was T.P. O'Connor for Scotland Road that he avoided the constituency and his constituents as often as he could. Some of this due to his snobbery, for his fellow countrymen, usually in Scotland Road, were quite poor, and apart from their respect for being extreme in politics, they had a huge reputation for drunkenness and being violent and unruly. At the same time, in his public manner, he had a reputation for sympathy, and this accounted for his popularity. In actual fact, people in those days did not expect their MP to hold surgeries. You know, people in 1920s, 1930s never had surgeries. Surgery was started after the Attlee government of 1945. Before that, the MPs never did have surgeries, and they didn't appear often in their constituencies. So he appears to be the first man to be chosen as Home Ruler, and he was done. That happened because in 1882, the annual conference of the Home Rulers was held in Liverpool, and he appealed to the imagination of the Irish Scousers, who saw him with his humour, his wit, his inspiration, his passion for Ireland, and they elected him in 1885. O'Connor moved to London in 1870, and he regarded London rather than Liverpool as the capital for the exiled Irishmen because of its glamour in literary and political life. Liverpool Scotland Division was created by the Redistribution Act of 1885, and O'Connor always referred to the large Irish presence in Liverpool ever since the 16th century. O'Connor used to claim that there were 2,000 Irish labourers in Liverpool in the 16th century. Among the Irish Ribbonism, a movement that was very secretive, attended to most of the needs of the Irish people. And when you read the research done by Dr. John Belsham, the public house and the publican was also extremely important in the construction of an ethnic awareness among the Irish exiles. Irish nationalism took a variety of forms in Liverpool, but in most instances, the pub was the centre of operation, from Ribbonite planning to Home Rule electoral canvassing. One of the most famous Irish pubs, which stood opposite the Clarence Dock. And the Clarence Dock was very handy because that's where the boats from Ireland used to come in. It was in the hands of a man called Jack Langan. He was an Irish champion boxer who made a great deal of money in Liverpool. And when he died in 1846, his estate was valued at 20,000. Langan was a celebrity. Another publican in the same league as him was Hugh McNulty. He had a pub in Grayson Street. And by far the best known man in Ireland was another Liverpool publican, John McArdle. An Ulsterman by birth, he hosted a large number of societies at his Crosby Street pub, including the second Hibernian Friendly Society, the third Hibernian Mechanical Society, and one of the ancient lodges of the ancient order of Hibernians. One must also remember, among the Irish, there was a teetotal nationalist alternative, which I have also mentioned with Father James Nugent. And Nugent was behind so many of the reforms among the Irish. He was responsible for the Clarence, which was a boat in the middle of the Mersey to teach Catholic lads who had gotten off the rails how to behave. He set up a farm school in Ainstill. He had a girls' centre in Old Swan. He set up the Catholic school for the blind. He established a convent of the Good Shepherd. And he also the convent of Mercy, the home of the aged poor. The sisters he brought from Belgium who nursed the sick from the poor areas. The Liverpool Catholic Protection Society, which found homes in Canada and America, especially in Missouri and Wisconsin, for neglected and forgotten children of Scotland Road. The Little Sisters of the Poor came also because of Nugent, and they collected food for the people who slept out on the streets, collecting from city centres, hotels and restaurants, as well as collecting scraps from St. John's Market. The best pickings being given to the inmates, some 138 of them in 1887, before the 15 sisters themselves had anything to eat. Nugent was the inspirational figure, a prophet of the needy, in this remarkable extension of social care and work among the Irish. But there were also other Irish priests like this man, Gerald Manley Hopkins. He was an interesting man. He learnt Welsh. He could write Welsh poetry in the strict meter. And he wrote some very interesting things about the Irish. And I think one thing that has remained with me from his writings is that he regarded the Irish as having a love-hate relationship with the city of Liverpool. And looking at the history over the century, I think he's near the mark. They had a love of Liverpool. They also hated Liverpool. And that comes out in the riots and in the violence that was witnessed in the city. The priests had a proud record in people like Manley Hopkins and Father James Nugent. A report was published in 1883 called Squalid Liverpool, and they gave special praise to the priests, the Catholic priests. They regarded him as the parson, the policeman, the doctor, the nurse, the relieving officer, the nuisance inspector, and the school board inspector, all in one. As the report indicated, there were no Protestant equivalent, though the Unitarians did well with a domestic mission in Dingle, and the Welsh did well also through Prince's Road and Dr. Owen Thomas. But one cannot forget this church of St. Jude's, where Father Manley Hopkins was a priest. And we cannot ever forget also the Anglo-Irish Protestant evangelists, who were the standard bearers. And this is one of them, Hugh MacNeill. He was called eloquent even beyond Irish eloquence. And he was a hardline Protestant evangelist. He was followed by a Londoner. There's the map of St. Jude's, so that you have an idea where it is. Those of you who don't know, and then we move on to George Wise. And I couldn't find a photograph. We couldn't find a photograph of George Wise. So what we put in here is Walton Prison, because he served 6 months in Walton Prison because of his leadership of a riot for the Orange Order and for the Irish extreme Protestants. He stirred up trouble wherever he went to. He was very much like John Kensett. And here is a cartoon of him. He and his father were John Kensett, the senior, and John Kensett, the junior, and John Kensett, the junior, was killed by an Irish Catholic out in Birkenhead. And that brought another riot into the 20th century. That happened in 1903. So I'm coming to the end of my talk. I told Mike that it would be about 50 minutes, but I must say that the Irish still have their witness in 20th century Liverpool. And it's a very interesting story. The Irish Centre down in Mount Pleasant has been closed, but they still have an Irish Centre, and there are a number of activities happening in that Irish Centre. And they still project a sense of Irishness to those whose roots are in Ireland. I mean, you've got the Liverpool Irish Society, the Liverpool Irish Literary Society, the Liverpool branch of Sinn Féin, the Gaelic League, the Gaelic Athletic Association, and Paisley failed in his attempt to set up a church in Netherfield Road, but he made an effort. But usually the Liverpool Irish have a very good record. Love-hate, I would call it. They have a lot of love for Liverpool, and they also brought in a great deal of hatred as well. And number of historians have written well on the Liverpool Irish, and I'm trying to do the same for the Liverpool Welsh, because we are cousins, the Irish and the Welsh. I've just begun the process, really, and there is a lot to say again. My friends in Wavertree Historical Society, but thank you very much for listening so well. I could see your faces. None of you have gone to sleep, as far as I know. And thank you, Mike, for doing the slides so well. And we're in capable hands with you and John Wood, the chairman. Thank you very much. And over to you, John, for the questions.
Well, thanks very much, Ben. That's a very illuminating talk. Thank you very much. I haven't got any questions on my chat, or am I missing something? Has anyone got any questions they'd like to ask?
I guess if I may ask a question.
Right. Yes.
Thank you.
And it was really just a question about when you look at the Irish people coming over and you go back and you look in the, should we say, the 1700s, mid 1700s, and the kind of navigators, the big builders of the canals. And I guess, were they of different types of people that say came over in the 1840s,
Yes,
which was maybe
yes.
more related to the
Quite.
famine? And did they, you know, in the latter time, did they more stay to the cities and like Liverpool, as against the navigators were following the canals? Were they very different people?
Different people, yes. I mean, those who came to build the canals were people that were strong, hardworking, and in good health. And they were needed because, I mean, I would say that the Irish, in my experience of seeing them over the years, they're tremendous workers. And we owe them a great debt in this country, in England and in Wales and in Scotland, for all the heavy work they've done. I mean, I think that quotation from the report of 1836 sums it up. All the heavy work of Liverpool is done by the Irish. And but unfortunately, between 1845 and 1850, those who came at that time had suffered so much because of the potato famine. And they were they came in desperation. They were so ill, many of them could not even face the journey to New York. That's where the intention was. So they stayed in Liverpool. And the problem with many of us who write on these things is to take the line that all the Irish that have been in Liverpool are like those poor, defenseless, hungry peasants who came between 1845 and 50. But I've shown you tonight that among the Irish that came to Liverpool, there were people of tremendous ability in journalism, in legal matters, in law, and you know, in the professions, doctors and nurses and so on. So the Irish needs really a better portrait, in my opinion, than the one that we often give them, just concentrating on the famine of 5 years rather than spreading it out as you've done with those that came to work on the canals and those that came to work on the docks in Liverpool. And, you know, they've given this city a great deal. So I'm very proud of their contribution.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's about the Irish nationalist MP O'Connor.
Yes.
Did he actually take his seat in Parliament?
Oh, yes.
Like the present.
He enjoyed it.
And
he loved it. He loved it.
Do we know something of the content of his speeches, perhaps?
Yeah, well, he wasn't. He was more involved in his. He was a tremendous. He was like a Rupert Murdoch. He loved journalism, and he started so many newspapers. He started even one, and with his own name as the title of the newspaper, TP Weekly. So he was very involved in that. I mean, he didn't take part in many, but one thing he did when during the Irish, when the police were rioting in Liverpool, he spoke up for them, in 1919, and there were occasions like that where he would be heard, but he wasn't heard often, and he wasn't seen often in Liverpool. But he was loved in Liverpool by his constituents, and even when they saw that the seat was really now by 1920 a Labour seat, he didn't yield. He carried on till 1928, and he was there from 1885 to 1928, which is a long time. And the only politician ever to have a seat in Britain, in mainland Britain, for the Irish nationalists.
Okay, well, can I thank Ben very much for his talk this evening, and perhaps we can all join together and show him in the normal way how we appreciate his talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Be nice to be with you.